Her only duty was to light the lamps, a simple task for a girl who was owned body and soul. But one night in the suffocating Mississippi heat, the flames that were meant to illuminate the parlor instead lit Lydia Carter's path to a place no one could follow. When the smoke cleared, the family she served was safe. The room was a blackened husk, but of Lydia only a legend remained, a story whispered in the dark about a shadow that never left. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The day began, as it always did, in darkness. Long before the Mississippi sun had summoned the will to burn through the thick, wet blanket of air that smothered the land, Lydia Carter was awake. The year was 1844, and the air on the Beaumont plantation was a palpable thing, heavy with the scent of damp earth, the lingering memory of last night's wood smoke, and the promise of another day's sweltering oppression. From the narrow cot in the stifling slave quarters, she could hear the world waking up around her. It was not the gentle bird song of a poet's morning, but a chorus of cicadas already buzzing with a frantic energy. A sound that vibrated in her bones and set her teeth on edge. It was the sound of time being eaten alive. Lydia moved with a quiet economy, her bare feet making no sound on the packed dirt floor. She was a young woman, though the precise number of her years was a detail no one had bothered to record. Her intelligence was a secret she guarded more fiercely than any possession, a sharp, observant quality that took in everything and betrayed nothing. Her eyes, dark and deep, missed little, from the first blush of dawn staining the eastern sky to the subtle shift in the overseer's posture that signaled his mood. She felt the weight of her bondage not as an abstract injustice, but as a constant personal theft. Each breath she took, each task she performed was a moment of her life siphoned away. A coin dropped into the Beaumont's overflowing coffers of stolen time. From the small glassless window of her cabin, she could see the main house. In the pre-dawn gloom, the great white-pillared mansion looked like a pristine ghost, its columns like bleached bones rising from the manicured lawn. It was a place of terrifying beauty, a monument to a power that was as absolute as it was unearned. Lydia's day would be spent in its shadow, her life dictated by the ringing of its bells and the whims of the family who slept within its cool, protected walls. She pulled on her coarse linen dress, the familiar scratch of the fabric a constant reminder of her station, and prepared to extinguish her own thoughts, to become the silent, efficient servant they expected her to be. Late that evening, the parlor ritual began. This was Lydia's primary duty, the task that set her apart from the field hands and even some of the other house servants. She was the keeper of the light. The grand parlor was the heart of the Beaumont's world, a chamber of suffocating luxury designed to impress and intimidate. Heavy velvet curtains, the color of dried blood, blocked out the night. Furniture imported from France, upholstered in rich brocades, stood polished and perfect on an expensive rug. And on the walls, the ancestors watched. Portraits of stern-faced Beaumont men and their pale, corseted wives stared down with painted eyes. A gallery of owners, a silent testament to the generations of oppression that had built this house and funded this life. For Lydia, entering the parlor was like stepping into a cage. The air was still and smelled of beeswax and old paper. Her task was a solitary and precise one. With practiced hands, she moved from lamp to lamp. She trimmed the wicks with a small pair of silver scissors, her movements deft and sure. She polished the delicate glass chimneys with a soft cloth until they gleamed, removing every trace of soot, every fingerprint. Then, with a steady hand, she would pour the whale oil from a heavy can, filling each lamp to the perfect level, never a drop too much or too little. Her actions were a study in grace and efficiency. a carefully constructed mask of perfect servitude that concealed the churning resentment within. As she worked, she felt the eyes of the portraits on her, their silent judgment a constant unnerving pressure. They saw not a person but an instrument, a tool for their comfort. They saw property. Tonight the pressure felt heavier. The air was unusually still, trapping the day's heat. As Lydia was carefully replacing a chimney on a lamp by the grand fireplace, the parlor door opened and James Beaumont entered. He was the master's son, a young man whose arrogance had been cultivated as carefully as the plantation's cotton. He possessed a cruel, casual entitlement that he wore as comfortably as his expensive leather boots. "Still at it, Lydia?" he asked, his voice smooth but carrying an undercurrent of command. "Make sure they burn bright tonight. We have important guests." Lydia did not look up from her task. To meet his gaze was to invite a confrontation she could not win. "Yes, Master James, they will," she murmured, her voice a low, neutral tone she had perfected over years of similar interactions. He moved closer, the scent of his cologne and the whiskey on his breath invading her space. He stopped beside her, his shadow falling over the lamp she was tending. He lowered his voice, a conspiratorial whisper that made the skin on her arms crawl. "My father says you're the most reliable girl on this plantation. I wonder just how reliable you can be." Then his hand was on her arm. His touch was not overtly violent, but it was heavy with the weight of ownership, a casual claim that was more insulting than a blow. Lydia flinched, a small, involuntary tremor that she immediately suppressed. She did not pull away, knowing that to do so would be seen as defiance, a provocation. It was a horrifying calculus she had to perform a dozen times a day. Instead, she subtly shifted her weight, moving the glass lamp she held so that it became a small, fragile barrier between them. Her mind flashed with a pure, white-hot rage, a fire that burned far brighter than any lamp. His touch felt like a brand, searing the fact of his power, her powerlessness, into her very skin. "The oil needs my attention, sir," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the wick. "I must be careful not to spill." For a long moment his hand remained, his thumb stroking her arm in a gesture of idle possession. Then, with a low chuckle and a self-satisfied smirk, he withdrew. He lingered for another second, watching her, before turning and leaving the room as silently as he had entered. Lydia remained perfectly still, her knuckles white where she gripped the lamp. She took a slow, deep breath, forcing the rage back down into the deep, carefully concealed well of her emotions. She would not give him the satisfaction of her fear or her anger, but the memory of his touch, the casual violation, remained. Later that night, long after the guests had departed and the house had fallen into a restless slumber, Lydia returned for her final check. The parlor was quiet now, the lamps casting a warm golden glow that softened the room's imposing grandeur. It was in this moment during her last solitary rounds that it happened. She was adjusting the flame on a tall lamp that stood perilously close to the heavy velvet curtains. A sudden, unexpected draft whispered through the room, likely from a window left carelessly ajar in an upstairs bedroom. It was a small thing, a minor shift in the air. But it was enough. The flame on the lamp, which she had just trimmed, was burning high and clean. The draft caught it, making it leap sideways, a hungry tongue of fire reaching for the driest, most flammable thing in the room. The curtain, old and thick with the dust of decades, was tinder. There was a soft whoosh, a sound like a sharp intake of breath as the fabric ignited. For a single surreal second, the orange flame was a thing of impossible beauty against the dark velvet, a vibrant flower blooming in the stuffy parlor. Then the beauty turned to terror. The fire did not climb, it exploded, racing up the length of the curtain with a horrifying speed. The smell of burning dust and aging fabric filled the air, quickly followed by the thick, acrid stench of smoke. Chaos erupted. Shouts echoed from the upper floors as the Beaumonts, roused by the smell and the sudden, flickering light, scrambled from their beds. Doors slammed open. Panicked voices called out names. But Lydia was frozen. Amidst the rising panic and the growing roar of the flames, she stood perfectly still, her face illuminated by the destructive light. The fire was no longer just a disaster, it was a presence. In that moment of intense, terrifying clarity, she saw it not as an accident, but as a consuming, cleansing force. It was eating the portraits, their painted eyes blistering and melting away. It was devouring the imported furniture, turning the symbols of her oppression into black, skeletal remains. The heat was immense, a physical blow, but she didn't move. The last thing anyone saw before the room was completely lost to a churning vortex of black smoke and orange flame was a silhouette, a slender figure standing defiant and calm, outlined against a wall of fire, a shadow etched in light just before the darkness swallowed everything. The fire was a ravenous beast, but even its hunger eventually died. What it left behind was a carcass. By the time the frantic, desperate efforts of the bucket brigade had subdued the last of the flames, the sun was a hazy, indifferent eye in the smoke-filled sky. The grand parlor of the Beaumont plantation was no more. It was a gaping wound in the side of the house, a black skeletal ruin open to the morning air. The fine French furniture was reduced to charcoal sculptures, their elegant curves now jagged and grotesque. The walls, once covered in expensive patterned paper, were stained with a thick, greasy layer of soot. Water dripped from the charred ceiling beams, hissing on the hot embers that still glowed like malevolent red eyes in the debris. The air was a nauseating cocktail of wet ash, burnt fabric, and something else. Something acrid and final. Master Alistair Beaumont stomped through the muddy yard, his face a mask of pure, undiluted fury. The water sloshing from the buckets had turned the pristine lawn into a quagmire, but he paid it no mind. His eyes were fixed on the ruin, and his calculations were not of safety or survival, but of cost. He saw not a near disaster, but a ledger book bleeding red ink. "The whole wing ruined!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. He gestured with a trembling hand towards a heap of blackened wood. "That settee was imported from France. It cost me a fortune." He kicked at a piece of debris, his fine leather boot sinking into the soot-blackened mud. His gaze swept over the exhausted faces of the enslaved workers who had fought the fire, their bodies slick with sweat and grime. But he did not see them. He saw only his ruined assets. His wife, Eleanor, stood a few feet away, clutching a silk robe to her throat. Her face was pale, her body trembling not from the morning chill, but from the shock of the night. "Alistair, please," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "The children are safe." "We are safe," he rounded on her, his eyes wild. "Safe? This is a catastrophe, and it happened on that girl's watch." His face hardened, the fury congealing into a cold, cruel resolve. He pointed a finger towards the smoldering doorway. "Find the girl. I want to know what happened. If she was careless, she will pay for every last cent of this." Eleanor flinched as if struck. Her eyes darted towards the blackened maw of the parlor, a place of horror and suffocating heat. "Alistair, the whole room was ablaze," she said, her voice barely audible. "The smoke, the heat. Perhaps she didn't make it out." The thought hung in the air, a terrible logical conclusion, a human cost to add to the financial one. But Alistair Beaumont merely scoffed, dismissing the notion with a wave of his hand. A slave's life was a minor entry in the grand accounting of his property, easily replaced. The French settee, however, was not. The search was a grim, perfunctory affair. The overseer, a man whose cruelty was as much a tool of his trade as the whip he carried, gathered a few of the field hands. They were given shovels and told to sift through the wreckage. Under the hardening gaze of the morning sun, they entered the ruin, their bare feet treading carefully on the hot, unstable floor. The air was still thick with the ghost of the fire, a fine black dust that coated their skin and filled their lungs with every breath. They poked and prodded through the ashes, their movements slow and methodical. They overturned the charred remains of a pianoforte, its strings curled into blackened wires. They sifted through the soot that had once been the expensive rug. They scraped at the piles of fallen plaster and burnt wood, looking for the one thing a fire of that intensity should have left behind. They found nothing. There was no body. There were no bones. Not even the smallest fragment that would indicate a person had been consumed by the inferno. They found the twisted, melted remains of the silver scissors Lydia used to trim the wicks. They found the shattered base of a lamp. But of Lydia herself there was not a trace, not a scrap of her coarse linen dress that could be distinguished from the general destruction, not a single sign that a human being had perished there. The overseer, a man not easily perplexed by the world, found himself standing in the center of the ruin, a deep frown creasing his sun-beaten face. He ran a hand through his greasy hair, his eyes scanning the blackened walls and the debris-strewn floor one last time. It made no sense. The fire had been an inferno trapped within the four walls of the parlor. There was no escape. He went to find Master Beaumont, who was now pacing impatiently on what remained of the veranda. The overseer removed his hat, a gesture of respect that was purely mechanical. "Sir," he began, his voice low and uncertain, "we've been through the whole room. Twice." Alistair stopped his pacing. "And did you find her?" The overseer shifted his weight, avoiding his master's piercing gaze. "No, sir. We found nothing." "Nothing? What do you mean, nothing?" Alistair snapped. "Did she run?" "I don't see how," the overseer admitted, shaking his head. "The fire took the whole room in minutes. The doorway was a wall of flame. There was nowhere to go." He paused, then added the words that would begin the legend. "It's like she just evaporated, sir." Alistair stared at him, his mouth agape, the fury on his face slowly being replaced by a profound and unsettling confusion. The world, for a moment, had ceased to operate by the rules he understood. Property did not simply vanish. In the slave quarters, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Here, the loss was not measured in dollars or imported furniture. Here, the mood was a somber cocktail of fear, grief, and a strange, budding awe. Sarah, a young woman who had shared a cabin with Lydia and considered her the closest thing she had to a sister, sat on a small wooden stool, her body racked with silent sobs. She wept for the friend she had lost, but she also wept from fear. She knew what happened to runaways, or even those suspected of running. "They'll say she ran," she whispered to the old man who sat beside her, his gnarled hand resting gently on her shoulder. "They'll send the dogs after her. They'll hunt her down." Old Jacob, an elder whose eyes had seen more seasons than anyone else on the plantation, shook his head slowly. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, each line a story of survival. He looked not at Sarah, but towards the main house, a dark silhouette against the now bright sky. "Hush now, child," he said, his voice a low, rumbling whisper that seemed to come from deep within the earth. "They found nothing. You heard the men talking, no blood, no bone." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Fire takes, but it always leaves a trace. A button, a tooth, something. This is different." He turned his head slightly, and Sarah saw an expression in his ancient eyes she had never seen before. It was not just wisdom, but a deep, knowing fear, as if he were looking at a truth far older and more powerful than the Beaumonts and their plantation. The community fell silent around them, listening. The idea began to take root, a seed of mystery planted in the fertile ground of their shared suffering. Lydia was gone, but perhaps she had not been taken. Perhaps she had left. A few nights later, the moon was a sharp silver sickle in the black sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. In the main house, sleep offered no escape for Mistress Eleanor. She lay awake in her grand four-poster bed, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The smell of smoke still clung to the curtains in her room, a constant phantom reminder of the fire. Finally, unable to bear the confines of her bed, she rose and walked to the window. Her bedroom overlooked the ruined wing of the house. The burnt-out windows of the parlor were like hollow, vacant eyes staring back at her. Black squares of absolute darkness against the moon-washed walls. The sight sent a shiver down her spine. She was about to turn away to draw the curtains and block out the morbid view when she saw it. A flicker of movement inside the ruin. It was so faint, so quick, she thought she had imagined it. She stared, her heart beginning to beat a little faster, her breath catching in her throat. She told herself it was an animal, a possum or a raccoon, drawn by the strange new landscape of the ruin. Or perhaps it was just the wind moving a loose piece of debris, a charred plank shifting in the moonlight. She waited, her eyes straining against the darkness, and then she saw it again. It was not an animal. It was a shadow, but it was unlike any shadow she had ever seen. The moonlight streaming into the ruin cast a complex web of light and dark, but this was something else. It was a patch of darkness that seemed to absorb the light around it, a shadow that was somehow darker than all the others. As she watched, paralyzed, this deeper shadow detached itself from the blackened back wall of the parlor. It did not move like a shadow cast by a swaying branch. It glided. It flowed along the soot-stained wall with a smooth, deliberate grace, a river of pure blackness moving through the dead room. For a moment it seemed to coalesce, to take on a vague, slender, upright form, before it reached another patch of deep darkness and melted back into it, disappearing completely. Eleanor stumbled back from the window, a hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her mind raced, desperately seeking a rational explanation, a trick of the light, a figment of her exhausted, overwrought imagination, the moon playing games with her tired eyes. It had to be, but the image was seared into her mind, a perfect, terrifying memory. The shadow had not just moved, it had moved with purpose. It had moved with a distinct human-like grace that felt unnervingly, terrifyingly familiar. It moved, she realized, with a jolt of pure ice in her veins, the way Lydia used to move when she thought no one was watching. Alistair Beaumont's confusion curdled into a black and venomous rage. The world had defied him. His property had been destroyed, and another piece of his property had simply ceased to exist, violating every law of commerce and nature he held dear. He was a man who believed in ledgers, in branding irons, in the solid, tangible reality of ownership. This airy mystery, this evaporation, was an insult to his authority, and he would not stand for it. He summoned his overseer, a cruel slip of a man named Finch, whose thin lips were permanently set in a sneer of contempt for the world, particularly the part of it that was bound in chains. Alistair's instructions were simple and brutal. Someone knew something. Someone had helped Lydia run, or someone was lying about what they saw. He wanted answers, and he authorized Finch to use any means necessary to extract them. The financial loss had been staggering, and Alistair intended to take it out on the flesh and blood of those who remained. Finch descended upon the slave quarters like a hawk upon a field of mice. His presence was a cold draft of fear, silencing the low murmurs of grief and speculation. He used the inexplicable disappearance as a license for terror. He tore through the small cabins, overturning meager possessions, his eyes searching for a hidden letter, A saved coin, any sign of a conspiracy. His questions were lashes themselves, sharp and stinging. He dragged men from their families and questioned them for hours under the blistering sun, his voice a low, menacing drone. But his true focus, his deepest suspicion, fell upon Sarah. He knew she and Lydia had been close. He saw her red-rimmed eyes and the tremor in her hands not as signs of grief but as the tells of a liar. He cornered her near the well, his shadow falling over her like a cage. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Did she have a lover? Some buck from another plantation who promised her a new life?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes fixed on the muddy ground at her feet. "I don't know, Mr. Finch, I swear I don't." "Don't lie to me, girl," he hissed, stepping closer, his foul breath washing over her. "She planned this, didn't she? The fire was a diversion, a clever trick. You helped her. You tell me where she went and maybe the master will be lenient." His methods grew harsher. He deprived her of food, then water, forcing her to work twice as hard in the laundry house until she nearly collapsed from heat and exhaustion. But through it all, she clung to her ignorance. An ignorance that was terrifyingly the truth. She had no information to give. Finch's brutality yielded nothing but deeper wells of fear and a silent, burning resentment that spread through the quarters like a fever. The investigation was a failure, a brutal exercise in futility that only served to prove that the Beaumont's power, for the first time, had met a boundary it could not cross. While Finch's reign of terror gripped the quarters, a different kind of torment was unfolding in the main house. James Beaumont had become a ghost in his own home. He was agitated, his movements jerky and uncertain. He snapped at the servants for the smallest infractions, and took to drinking heavily, even in the morning. He avoided the entire left wing of the house, taking long, circuitous routes through the gardens to get from one room to another, as if the very ground near the parlor was poisoned. The sight of the blackened, gaping windows seemed to physically repel him. Anyone who mentioned Lydia's name in his presence was met with a furious, defensive outburst that was as sudden as it was violent. His father, Alistair, watched his son's deterioration with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. One evening, as James was pouring himself a third glass of whiskey before supper, Alistair confronted him. The air in the dining room was thick with unspoken accusations. "You were in the parlor that night," Alistair stated, his voice cold and flat. "Just before the fire. I had a servant tell me. Did you see anything?" James flinched, sloshing whiskey over the rim of his glass. He turned, his eyes bloodshot and defiant. "I saw fire. What else was there to see?" he retorted, his voice too loud in the quiet room. "It was an accident. The girl was clumsy. She was always clumsy." "She was the most careful servant we owned," Alistair countered, his eyes narrowing. "And this was a very expensive accident. A missing slave is a theft from my pocket, James. A loss I must account for." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a low growl. "So I will ask you again. What happened in that room?" James was haunted, but not by the ghost of a girl. He was haunted by the memory of his own actions, by the feel of her arm under his hand, the flash of defiance in her eyes that he had tried to extinguish. He was terrified that his father would somehow uncover his role in the incident, not because he feared for Lydia's fate, but because he feared being blamed for the destruction of the property. The thought of his father's financial wrath was a far more terrifying specter to him than any spirit. "Nothing happened," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I spoke to her. I told her to be careful with the lamps. She was insolent, so I left. The fire started after. It had nothing to do with me." He slammed the glass down on the sideboard, the sound echoing the shattering of his composure. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, his guilt a toxic secret that was eating him alive from the inside out. As the Beaumonts' world frayed, the phenomenon that had started it all began to intensify. The sightings of the shadow were no longer confined to the uncertain moonlit hours of the night. They became more frequent, more brazen, and much, much harder to dismiss. The breaking point came on a hot, still afternoon. Mistress Eleanor, in a desperate attempt to impose some order on the decaying house, had instructed a young housemaid named Clara to begin nailing boards over the ruined parlor's doorways. It was a practical measure meant to keep animals out and to prevent the horrifying sight of the ruin from greeting visitors. Clara, her arms full of rough-sawn planks and a heavy hammer, approached the doorway with trepidation. The air grew cold as she neared the opening, a damp, cellar-like chill that had no place in the sweltering Mississippi heat. She could hear a faint, almost inaudible sound, like the whisper of silk sliding over stone. She peered into the gloom of the ruined room. For a moment she saw nothing but the familiar landscape of destruction, the black walls and the skeletal remains of furniture. Then on the far wall the soot began to move. It was not drifting, not falling. It was gathering. The fine black particles swirled together, coalescing with an unnatural purpose. Before her terrified eyes the soot formed a shape, a perfect slender silhouette of a woman. It was flat against the wall, yet it had a terrifying depth, a presence that seemed to suck the very air from the room. Clara stood frozen, the hammer slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the floor. The silhouette was still for a moment, a statue carved from ash and shadow. Then, with a slow, deliberate grace that was both fluid and impossible, the top of the silhouette, its head, turned. It turned to look directly at her. There were no features, no eyes, no face, only a void in the shape of a head. But Clara felt its gaze, a cold, heavy pressure that seemed to pierce her very soul. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The silhouette held her gaze for a heartbeat, and then, as smoothly as it had formed, it dissolved. The particles of soot seemed to release from their invisible bonds, drifting apart and settling back into a random, meaningless pattern on the wall. The spell was broken. Clara screamed. It was not a small cry of fright, but a raw, primal shriek of pure terror that tore from her lungs and echoed through the entire house. She scrambled backwards, falling over the boards she had dropped, and fled, her screams trailing behind her. The story, now given the weight of a hysterical but undeniable witness, spread like wildfire. It blazed through the main house, from the kitchen to the bedrooms, and then leaped to the slave quarters, where it was met not with shock, but with a grim, knowing acceptance. The shadow was no longer a secret fear whispered by the mistress of the house. It was a known phenomenon. It had a name, a shape, and a terrifying, undeniable presence. It was the shadow of Lydia Carter. The terror of Finch's investigation and the escalating horror in the main house drove Sarah inward. She performed her duties in a fog of fear, her body moving on instinct while her mind sought refuge in the past. The constant threat of the overseer, his accusations, and his cruelty forced her to retreat into her memories of Lydia, searching for some clue, some explanation that the Beaumonts and their world could never provide. She remembered Lydia's quiet defiance, her sharp intellect, the way she would watch the world with an unnerving stillness. And then one evening, as she sat huddled in her cabin, the memory came to her, sharp and clear. It had been a few months before the fire. Lydia had pulled her aside, her eyes shining with a secret excitement. She had led Sarah to a quiet spot behind the smokehouse and shown her a small pouch she had made from a scrap of stolen velvet. It was hidden in a hollow of an old oak tree. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft moss, were a few strange objects. There were scraps of colorful thread, a bright blue jay's feather, and a small, gnarled piece of root, dark and twisted like an old man's finger. Sarah had looked at the collection, confused. They were just trifles, things a child might collect. but Lydia had spoken in a low, reverent whisper. She spoke of her great-grandmother, a woman brought over from Africa on a slave ship, who had carried with her the old ways. She believed that a person's spirit was not a prisoner of their body, that it was not bound to the flesh and bone that could be bought and sold. At the time, Sarah had been frightened by such talk. It sounded like dangerous magic, the kind of thing that brought nothing but trouble. She had dismissed it as stories, as a way for Lydia to cope with the hopelessness of their lives. Now, huddled in the dark, Lydia's words came back to her with the force of a prophecy. "My great-grandmother taught my grandmother, who taught my mother," Lydia had whispered, her fingers tracing the shape of the twisted root. "She said that when the chains get too heavy, there are other ways to be free, ways they can't see." Sarah remembered asking what she meant, what other ways there could be besides running, a path that almost always ended in capture and brutal punishment. Lydia had looked up from the pouch, her dark eyes meeting Sarah's. A small, secret smile had touched her lips. "There are more ways to be free than just running," she had said, her voice full of a conviction that Sarah had not understood at the time. Now the words echoed in the terrified silence of the cabin, no longer a simple statement but a key to a door Sarah had never known existed. She looked towards the darkened, haunted mansion, and for the first time she wondered if Lydia's disappearance was not an end, but a transformation. She wondered if the shadow the Beaumonts feared was not a ghost, but a victory. The house had grown cold. It was a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside, where the Mississippi heat still pressed down like a physical weight. It was a coldness of the spirit emanating from the ruined parlor and seeping through the floorboards, creeping along the hallways until the entire mansion felt like a tomb. Mistress Eleanor felt it most acutely. The terror of the servants, the whispers that fell silent the moment she entered a room, and the hollow, haunted look in her own son's eyes had coalesced into a dreadful certainty. The house was sick, and James was at the heart of the disease. She found him in the library, a book lying open and unread in his lap, a glass of amber liquid sweating onto the polished wood of the table beside him. He was staring at the wall, but his focus was miles away, lost in some internal landscape of fear. Eleanor, plagued by nightmares and the growing palpable sense of a hostile presence in her home, could no longer abide the silence. Her usual timidity had been burned away, replaced by the fierce, desperate courage of a mother watching her world crumble. "The servants are terrified," she began, her voice low but clear, cutting through the heavy silence. "They won't go near the West Wing. Clara is still having hysterics. They say it's Lydia's ghost." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "They say she haunts the parlor, that her shadow walks the walls." She took a step closer, her gaze pinning her son in his chair. "What did you do to that girl, James?" The question struck him like a physical blow. He flinched, the color draining from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. "Nothing," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. "I did nothing. It was an accident. An accident that left a girl missing and my house in ruins." Eleanor pressed, her voice gaining a sharp, steely edge. "An accident that has turned my home into a place of fear. I will not have it, James. I want the truth." For a long moment he just stared at her, his jaw working silently. The arrogant, entitled young master was gone, replaced by a frightened, cornered boy. And then he broke. The facade of defiance and anger shattered, and a wave of pathetic, self-pitying sobs racked his body. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "Nothing," he wept, his voice muffled and thick with tears. I just spoke to her. She was defiant, insolent." He looked up, his face streaked with tears. his eyes pleading for an understanding he did not deserve. She looked at me like I was dirt beneath her feet. So I grabbed her arm. He choked on a sob, the confession tumbling out in a torrent of shame and fear. She slapped me, he whispered, the admission costing him a visible effort. Right across the face. No one has ever. She slapped me. I was so angry I pushed her back. The lamp, the tall one by the curtain, it fell. He looked at his mother, his expression a grotesque mask of terror and regret. It all happened so fast, the flame, the curtain, it just whoosh. I didn't mean for it to happen, I swear it. He scrambled for an excuse, for a way to mitigate his own cowardice. I thought she ran out after me. I ran and I thought she was right behind me. I swear it, Mother. I thought she got out. Eleanor stood frozen, the blood turning to ice in her veins. The confession was both a relief and a new kind of horror. It provided a rational, worldly explanation for the fire, a sordid tale of arrogance and a clumsy, violent struggle. But it only deepened the central, terrifying mystery. If Lydia had not been consumed by the flames, if she had been alive when James fled the room, then where was her body? Where had she gone? Eleanor looked at her weeping son, at his pathetic, crumbling form, and she felt a wave of revulsion so profound it made her physically sick. It was not just the fire, not just the lie, it was the casual cruelty of it, the confirmation of the rotten core she had long suspected lay within him. Her son was not just a fool, he was a coward and a brute, and his actions had invited something terrible into their lives. The raised voices from the library, sharp and angry, carried through the open windows and into the yard where Sarah was folding clean linens. She heard James's broken sobs and Eleanor's sharp, accusing tones. She could not make out the words, but the sound of the Beaumonts' world fracturing was unmistakable. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Clutching the laundry basket to her chest, she fled, not back to the oppressive heat of the laundry house, but towards the small, quiet cabin where old Jacob lived. She needed to understand. She needed the wisdom of someone whose memory stretched back further than the Beaumonts' reign. She found him sitting outside his cabin on a low stool, carving a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and his face, a network of deep lines and ancient knowledge, was calm and still. He looked up as she approached, his dark eyes seeming to know why she had come before she even spoke. Sarah's words came out in a rush, a torrent of fear and confusion. She told him about the argument she'd overheard, about the escalating terror in the house, and finally, her voice dropping to a whisper, she told him about Lydia's secret pouch. The colored threads, the feather, and the twisted root. She told him what Lydia had said, the words that now echoed in her mind day and night. There are more ways to be free than just running. Jacob listened without interruption, his hands never ceasing their slow, methodical work with the knife. The wood shavings fell like pale snow around his feet. When she was finished, the silence stretched, filled only by the buzz of insects and the distant sounds of the plantation. He looked past her, his old eyes gazing into the distance, as if reading a story written on the air itself. Finally he spoke, his voice a low, resonant hum. "Your friend was a wise girl," he said softly. "Wiser than they knew. She listened to the old stories." He set his carving aside and leaned forward, his gaze meeting hers. He began to tell her a story passed down through generations, a piece of history that had never been written in any of Master Beaumont's books. He spoke of Lydia's great-grandmother, a woman stolen from a land of sun and spirits. He said that when she was brought to this country in the belly of a ship, she had not come alone. She had brought with her the knowledge of the shadows. They say she was a woman of power. Jacob's voice was a hypnotic whisper. That when the chains got too heavy and the whip cut too deep, she learned how to walk into her own shadow. She learned how to trade the flesh for the spirit, to leave the aching body behind and become a thing of will and memory. He saw the fear and confusion in Sarah's eyes and held up a gnarled hand. "It is not a ghost story, child. Ghosts are sad things, echoes of a life that was taken. This is different. This is a story of freedom." Her body was their property, yes. They could chain it, whip it, sell it. But her spirit, her will, that was her own. She found a way to unhitch it from the flesh they claimed to own. She left her body behind, but her presence, her will, remained. He gestured with his chin towards the great house, now silhouetted against the setting sun. "It is not a story of a haunting. It is a story of a claiming she is not trapped in that room. She has taken it." That night, the terror became personal. James Beaumont, having cried himself into an exhausted, whiskey-fueled sleep, awoke with a gasp. His heart was pounding, the tattered edges of a nightmare clinging to him like a shroud. The room was bathed in the stark, silver light of the moon which poured through his large bedroom window. He sat up, his body slick with a cold sweat, and tried to calm his racing pulse. It was just a dream. It was the whiskey. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw that he was not alone. The moonlight streaming through the window cast a perfect, sharp-edged rectangle of light on the far wall, bisected by the dark, cross-shaped shadow of the window frame. It was a familiar sight, one he had seen 1,000 times. But tonight it was wrong. The shadow of the frame was distorted, unnaturally thick in one place. As he stared, his breath catching in his throat, a part of that shadow, a slender, tall shape, detached itself from the cross. It was a seamless, silent separation, like a drop of ink bleeding from a line. The shape flowed, moving away from the window's shadow and gliding across the moonlit patch of wall with a horrifying, liquid grace. It had no features, no substance. It was pure, featureless black. A hole in the world in the shape of a woman. It moved with an undeniable purpose, flowing steadily, silently across the wall directly towards his bed. He felt its presence as a physical force, an accusatory weight that pressed down on his chest, stealing his breath. There was no sound, no wind, no earthly reason for this impossible sight. It was a violation of every law of light and physics he knew. The shadow was not cast by anything. It was a thing in and of itself. It was her. He knew it with a certainty that bypassed his brain and settled deep in his bones. It was Lydia, and she had come for him. He opened his mouth to call for help, to scream for his father, but all that escaped was a dry, rasping croak. The shadow reached the edge of the moonlight and slipped into the darkness right beside his bed. He could feel it there, a concentration of cold and silent judgment. The last vestiges of his control, of his arrogance, of his belief in his own safety shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. He screamed. It was not a shout of anger or a cry of fear, but a raw, primal sound of pure, soul-shattering terror. The sound of a man who has just looked into the abyss and seen it looking back. The scream echoed through the cold, silent house, a fitting anthem for the ruin that was descending upon the Beaumont plantation. The rot was no longer confined to the parlor or the family's frayed nerves. It had spread to the very foundations of Alistair's kingdom. His tyranny, once a tool of absolute control, now only bred more fear and inefficiency. The workforce, already exhausted and resentful, was now haunted. They moved through their tasks like sleepwalkers, their eyes constantly darting towards the main house, their hands trembling as they worked. Every snapped twig, every sudden shadow sent them scattering. Cotton went unpicked, tools were misplaced and a sullen, unproductive silence fell over the fields. Alistair's response was to increase the pressure, ordering more lashes from Finch, but the whip had lost its power. It could command the body, but it could not command a mind paralyzed by a fear far greater than any physical pain. The final blow came not from a spirit, but from the world of men. Alistair, desperate to recoup some of his financial losses, had arranged to sell a large parcel of undeveloped land to a neighboring planter. The deal was all but done, the price agreed upon. But then, the buyer backed out. The reason, delivered by a hesitant messenger, was that rumors had begun to spread through the county. Travelers spoke of a pall of smoke that never quite left the Beaumont land, of screams in the night, of a plantation that was cursed. They spoke of a haunted plantation, a place where the shadows themselves had risen up in rebellion. The story, embellished and twisted, had soured the deal completely. No one wanted to invest in blighted land. Alistair Beaumont, the master of hundreds of acres and dozens of souls, was trapped. He was a king in a crumbling castle, besieged by an enemy he could not see, could not fight, and could not possibly comprehend. His wealth and power were built on land and bodies, and now one was tainted and the other was lost to him, vanished into a shadow that was slowly, methodically devouring his world. The Beaumont family, once a tightly bound unit of privilege and power, had shattered like a dropped porcelain doll. The pieces lay scattered throughout the cold, silent house, sharp-edged and irreparable. The arguments had ceased, but the silence that replaced them was heavier, more suffocating than any shouted word. It was the silence of a tomb, a quiet acknowledgement of a defeat so total it required no further discussion. Eleanor had moved into a guest room at the farthest end of the mansion, a self-imposed exile. She had packed a few belongings as if she were a visitor in her own home and closed the door on her marriage and her son. She refused to speak to James, her gaze sliding past him in the hallways as if he were a piece of furniture. Her silence a more profound condemnation than any accusation she could have leveled. Her days were spent staring out the window, her face a pale, emotionless mask, while the life she had known dissolved around her. Alistair, stripped of his authority and his financial security, had retreated into the dark, syrupy embrace of the bottle. His fury, which had burned so hot in the days after the fire, had finally exhausted its fuel, leaving behind only the cold, gray ash of sullen despair. He would sit for hours in his study, a decanter of brandy always at his elbow, his eyes fixed on the ledgers that now seemed to mock him with their tales of past profits. He was a king who had lost his kingdom, not to an invading army, but to a whisper, a rumor, a shadow. The loss was so absolute, so nonsensical that his mind could not grasp it, and so he drank, seeking a numbness that never quite arrived. The servants learned to read the depth of his despair in the level of the brandy in the decanter, their movements around him slow and cautious, as if tending to a wounded, unpredictable animal. And James was a ghost, haunting the halls of his own home long before his death. The encounter in his bedroom had broken something fundamental within him. The raw, primal terror of that night had scoured him clean of his arrogance, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell of a man. He was a creature of twitches and starts, his eyes constantly darting to the corners of the room, his body flinching at every unexpected shadow. He saw her everywhere, in the dark shape of a coat hanging on a door, in the flicker of a candle's flame, in the long, distorted shadows cast by the setting sun. He no longer drank for pleasure or bravado, but for oblivion, a desperate attempt to silence the screaming in his own mind. The house, once his playground and his birthright, had become his prison, each shadow a bar, each darkened room a cell where his own personal tormentor waited patiently. The very air in the Beaumont mansion was thick with the dust of decay and the fine black powder of psychological collapse. While the Beaumonts disintegrated, the shadow in the parlor grew bolder. Its manifestations became more deliberate, less fleeting. It was no longer content to simply glide along the walls or flicker in the moonlight. It began to communicate. Sarah, drawn by a force she could neither name nor resist, found herself watching the ruined parlor from the concealment of the overgrown gardens. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but a deeper, more powerful need to understand, to bear witness, compelled her to return day after day. She would hide behind a thicket of untended rose bushes, her heart pounding, and watch the black, gaping maw of the ruin. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, she saw it. The air inside the parlor grew still, and the fine layer of soot on the far wall began to move. It was not the random drift of air currents. The black particles swirled with a quiet, terrifying purpose, like iron filings drawn by an invisible magnet. A slender line of darkness began to trace a pattern in the soot, a deliberate, controlled movement that was both horrifying and mesmerizing. The shadow was writing. Sarah watched, her breath held tight in her chest as the shape took form. It was a symbol, a complex swirl with a sharp, straight line cutting through it. Her mind reeled. She had seen that symbol before. She had seen Lydia practicing it in the dirt with a stick, her brow furrowed in concentration. A memory, sharp and vivid, pierced through her fear. Lydia whispering about her mother and her mother's mother, about a secret language of symbols passed down, a way of writing that belonged only to them. A history kept safe from the eyes of their masters. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. This was not a random haunting, not a mindless echo of a tragedy. This was a message. Day after day she returned to her hiding place, and day after day the shadow wrote. New symbols appeared, traced by that impossible finger of darkness, forming a silent narrative on the blackened wall. Sarah, perhaps the only person left in the world who could read this spectral alphabet, began to piece together the story the shadow was telling. It was a story of pain, of defiance, of a spirit that refused to be extinguished. The shadow was not just a presence, it was a historian, and the wall of the ruined parlor was its scroll. Alistair Beaumont had reached his breaking point. The rumors, the financial ruin, the contemptuous pity in the eyes of his neighbors, and the ever-present suffocating fear in his own home had fermented into a volatile, drunken rage. One evening, after draining nearly an entire decanter of brandy, he slammed his fist down on his desk, the sound cracking through the house's dead silence. He would not be driven from his own home by a ghost, a trick of the light, a figment of his servant's superstitious imaginations. He was the master of this land, and everything on it, living or dead, was his property, subject to his will. In his drunken, desperate mind, he decided there was only one way to deal with defiance. He would purge this spirit by force. He stumbled out of his study and made his way to the barn, his movements clumsy but filled with a renewed, furious purpose. His eyes fell upon the bullwhip, coiled like a sleeping snake on a wooden peg. It was the ultimate symbol of his authority and the instrument with which he had enforced his will and broken the spirits of men stronger than himself. He snatched it from the peg, the worn leather of the handle feeling solid and real in his trembling hand. This, he understood, this was power. He stormed out of the barn and marched across the yard, the whip trailing behind him, his destination the blackened, silent parlor. He did not hesitate at the doorway. He plunged into the cold, dark ruin, the stench of old smoke and decay filling his lungs. The room was a void, swallowing the last of the evening light. He stood in the center of the destruction, a pathetic tyrant in a ruined kingdom, and raised the whip. "Get out!" he screamed, his voice a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the oppressive silence. "Get out of my house!" He cracked the whip, the sharp, explosive sound echoing like a gunshot in the enclosed space. The leather tip struck the soot-stained wall, leaving a pale scar in the blackness. "You are my property," he roared, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and hysteria. "In life or in death, you belong to me. I am the master here." He cracked the whip again and again, a frantic, mad dance of impotence, striking at the silent walls, the charred furniture, the unmoving air. "I command you to leave," he shrieked, his words dissolving into a desperate, gasping sob. He was screaming at an enemy he could not see, fighting a foe he could not strike, his power a meaningless joke in the face of the silent, watching darkness. And then the darkness responded. It was not a flicker, not a whisper. It was an answer. From the blackened walls, from the charred floor, from the very air of the ruined parlor, the shadow began to pour. It was not a trick of the light, it was a substance, a river of pure, silent blackness that flowed out of the parlor doorway like a plume of thick, heavy smoke. It moved with a terrifying speed and a silent, inexorable purpose, flowing across the veranda, down the steps, and onto the manicured lawn, killing the moonlight where it touched. Alistair stood frozen in the doorway, the whip hanging limp in his hand, his drunken rage evaporating in a sudden, soul-freezing chill. The river of darkness did not dissipate. It flowed with a clear destination, moving directly towards the center of the yard, towards the one object that was the absolute heart of Alistair Beaumont's power, the place where his authority was made manifest in blood and pain. It flowed to the whipping post. The shadow coalesced there, a vortex of blackness swirling around the thick, scarred wood. It wrapped itself around the post, climbing it, consuming it, and then, for a single breathtaking moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity, it took form. It was the clear, defiant form of Lydia Carter. She was not a ghost, not a transparent, shimmering specter. She was a figure of immense power and absolute stillness, sculpted from the very essence of shadow. Her form was solid, her edges sharp against the moonlit sky. She stood not tied to the post, but fused with it, as if she had claimed it, conquered it, and made it her own. Her head was held high, her featureless face turned directly towards the man in the doorway. She had no eyes, but Alistair felt her gaze upon him, a gaze of judgment so profound and so absolute that it stripped him bare, peeling back the layers of his pride, his wealth, his power, leaving only the small, terrified, and wanting soul beneath. The form held for a single, silent heartbeat. And then, as smoothly and silently as it had appeared, it dissolved. The shadow unwound itself from the post and flowed back into the ambient darkness of the night, vanishing completely, leaving behind only the scarred wooden post, the silent, watching house, and the shattered man on the veranda. Alistair dropped the whip. It fell from his nerveless fingers and landed with a soft thud in the damp grass. The drunken fury drained from him, replaced by a terror so profound, so soul-shattering, that it hollowed him out completely. He had screamed his ownership into the darkness, and the darkness had answered by showing him the true nature of power. He had been judged, and he had been found wanting. The terror that shattered Alistair Beaumont was not a fleeting thing. It was a fundamental breakage, a severing of the connection between the man he believed himself to be and the pathetic, trembling creature he had become. The flight began that very night. There was no discussion, no plan. There was only a shared, unspoken understanding that to remain in that house for another sunrise was an impossibility. The authority they had wielded for generations had been met, judged, and dismissed by a power they could not comprehend, and their only recourse was to run. Their departure was a study in silent, shameful panic. They did not pack with the careful consideration of a family embarking on a journey. They moved through the darkened rooms of their home like thieves, snatching at valuables with trembling hands. Eleanor, her face hidden behind a thick veil as if she were already in mourning for her own life, moved with a stiff, automaton-like grace, placing silver candlesticks and her mother's jewelry into a leather trunk. She did not speak a word. Her silence was a wall, protecting her from the final, utter collapse of her husband and son. Alistair, who had once commanded his entire world with a roar, was now a stooped, shuffling old man. His hands shook so violently he could barely fasten the clasp on a satchel into which he had thrown a few stacks of paper money and a bottle of brandy. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now dull and unfocused, staring at a future that had become a black, formless void. James was the most unnerving of all. He was catatonic. The primal scream had emptied him of everything, leaving a vacant shell. He sat in the carriage, his gaze fixed on some point in the middle distance, his body utterly still. He had not spoken since his father had half-carried, half-dragged him from the house. He was a living monument to their defeat. They threw their hastily packed trunks into a single carriage, the thuds echoing in the unnatural quiet of the night. They did not say goodbye to the servants who watched, silent and unseen, from the shadows of the quarters. They did not take a final look at the fields of cotton that had been the source of their wealth. They simply climbed into the carriage, a silent, veiled woman, a broken old man, and a catatonic boy, and surrendered. As the carriage rolled away under the cover of darkness, its wheels crunching on the gravel drive for the last time, it left behind the grand house, the ruined parlor, and all their belongings, abandoning them to the silence, the shadows, and the eternal watchful presence that had claimed it all. Their departure was not an escape, it was an abdication. In the weeks and months that followed the Beaumonts' shameful flight, the abandoned plantation began to curdle in the minds of the local populace. It became a place of stories, a focal point for the fears and hopes of a divided community. Two distinct legends sprang from the fallow ground, growing in opposite directions like a tree in its shadow. For the white settlers and neighboring planters, the Beaumont place became a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered over glasses of whiskey and behind fluttering fans. It was a place to be avoided, a blight on the landscape. Travelers on the nearby road would spur their horses, averting their eyes from the sight of the grand house with its gaping, blackened wound. They spoke of a curse, of the sin of pride being punished by a vengeful spirit. They told stories of hearing a woman's screams on the wind, of seeing strange lights flickering in the ruined parlor on moonless nights. The story became a convenient morality play, a way for them to reinforce their own sense of order and propriety. The Beaumonts had failed, they whispered, because Alistair had lost control, because his son was weak, because his wife was frail. The shadow of Lydia Carter in their telling was a malevolent phantom, a slave's ghost who, in her unholy rage, had brought ruin upon her betters. It was a story designed to keep the existing order intact, to frame rebellion, even a spectral one, as a destructive and demonic act. But for the black community in the quiet cabins and secret praise houses, a different story was told. It was not a ghost story, it was a gospel. They did not speak of Lydia's ghost, a word that implied a sad, lingering remnant of a life cut short. They spoke of Lydia's freedom. They spoke of her not as a victim, but as a conqueror. Her story was not whispered in fear, but recounted with a quiet, fierce pride. She had not been destroyed by the fire, they said. She had used it. She had burned away her chains, burned away her name, burned away the very body that had been branded as property. She had, through an act of incredible will, transformed herself. The shadow was not a haunting, it was a monument. They said she had become a guardian spirit of the land, a silent watcher who had reclaimed the ground that had been stolen and worked with the blood and sweat of her people. The abandoned plantation was not a place of fear for them, but a place of pilgrimage. A young man seeking the courage to escape his own bondage might walk the perimeter of the property at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of the shadow, hoping to draw strength from Lydia's ultimate act of self-emancipation. Her story became a promise, a secret scripture of hope that whispered that the Master's power was not absolute, that there were forms of freedom beyond their comprehension, and that a spirit, if strong enough, could never truly be owned. The years turned, seasons bled into one another, and the world changed. The war came and went, a storm of fire and blood that tore the old world apart and left a new, uncertain one in its place. 25 years after the Beaumonts had fled into the night, the land around the ruined plantation was different. The fields were parceled out, worked by free men and women, their hands now working for themselves. On a cool evening, as the sun bled orange and purple across the horizon, an elderly woman sat on the porch of a small, well-kept cabin. Her name was Sarah, and the face that had once been tight with fear was now a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, each line a testament to a life of hardship, survival, and finally, peace. Her hair was a cloud of white, and her eyes, though old, were clear and bright with the fire of memory. Gathered at her feet, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of a small, crackling fire, were her grandchildren. They were children of freedom, born into a world Lydia could only have dreamed of. They were boisterous and full of life, their laughter a sound that would have been silenced on the old plantation. As the sky deepened to indigo, they grew quiet, their eyes fixed on their grandmother. It was time for the story. "Tell us again, Grandma," a young girl whispered, her head resting on Sarah's knee. "Tell us about the Shadow Lady." Sarah smiled, a slow, gentle curving of her lips. She looked at their eager faces, and she began to tell them the true story of Lydia Carter. She did not tell them a ghost story. She told them a story of power. "They thought they owned her," Sarah began, her voice a low, melodic hum that blended with the chirping of the crickets. "They thought they owned her because they owned her mother and her mother before that. They put their name on her, put their chains on her, and thought that was the end of the story." She leaned forward, her expression growing intense. "But they only owned her body, and that was the least part of her. Her spirit was a fire they couldn't see, and it was older and stronger than any of them. She traded that body for a freedom no man could ever take away, a freedom no whip could touch, no chain could hold." She looked towards the distant dark shape of the old Beaumont land, now just a shadow against the stars. "Her shadow isn't a sad thing, children," she said, her voice firm and clear. "It's a promise. It's the story of our strength, written on the walls of their failure." She reached into a small cloth bag she kept beside her and pulled out a smooth, flat stone. With a piece of charcoal from the edge of the fire, she began to draw on its surface. She drew a swirl with a sharp, straight line cutting through it. The children watched, mesmerized. "She had her own words," Sarah explained, her finger tracing the symbol. "A language of her own, passed down from the mothers, a way of remembering who we were. This is how she wrote her story on that wall." She drew another symbol, then another, teaching them the secret alphabet, passing the legacy from her memory into theirs, ensuring that the true story of Lydia Carter, the story of a woman who had refused to be erased, would never be forgotten. The final scene returns to the present day, to the ruins that have become a legend. The Beaumont Parlor is no longer a stark, black wound. Nature, patient and persistent, has begun to reclaim it. Thick ropes of ivy crawl over the crumbling brick, their green leaves a vibrant contrast to the blackened stone. Wildflowers grow in the cracks of the foundation, and a young sapling, defiant and alive, has taken root in the center of the room, its branches reaching up through the collapsed roof towards the open sky. The moonlight, no longer a harsh, interrogating glare, streams down, soft and forgiving, dappling the overgrown floor in shifting patterns of silver and black. It is a place of profound and peaceful decay, a monument not to destruction, but to the relentless passage of time. Most of the walls have crumbled, but one, the far wall where the shadow first wrote its silent story, remains largely intact. It is a canvas of soot and stone, weathered by decades of sun and rain. As the moon climbs to its zenith, the air in the ruin grows still. The chirping of the crickets seems to fade, and a deep, expectant silence descends. On that one remaining wall there is a flicker of movement. It is subtle at first, a deepening of the darkness in one corner, a place where the ivy's shadow is thickest. Then, as if taking a slow, deliberate breath, a shadow detaches itself from the greater darkness. It is slender and tall, a column of pure, featureless black against the mottled gray of the stone. It is not a projection, not a trick of the light. It possesses a weight, a presence, a substance all its own. It glides from the corner, moving with a fluid, silent grace across the ancient, soot-stained wall. It straightens, coalescing into a form that is unmistakably human, a figure of immense power and stillness. It turns its featureless head, a slow, deliberate movement, and looks out through the broken frame of a window, out over the fields that are now free, over the small cabins where new generations live and dream. It is a silent, powerful, and eternal watcher. Her vanishing was not an end. It was not an escape. It was her ultimate act of self-creation. A final, absolute refusal to be owned. A transformation from a body in bondage to a spirit that was and would forever be free.